What would you do if you didn't receive your wedding photo gallery? And not the handful of sneak peeks, those few photos that you might get anywhere between 24 hours and a couple of weeks after, but all of the photos of your entire wedding day or days. As weeks turn to months after your wedding and you still haven't gotten your photos back, it can start to feel like your memories are being held hostage. And that's when the panic can set in. Catastrophizing at this point is not uncommon. Thoughts like, did your photographer lose your photos? Were their SD cards damaged? Did they not back them up? Why are they still posting other couples' photos on socials and or going on holidays? You can really start to spiral, and I've heard about it and seen the posts on Facebook wedding groups, and it's not great for anyone. Today I'm breaking down how long is too long to wait for your wedding gallery, why delays sometimes happen and how to handle them, and why communication is key. I reached out to 10 of the Unbridely Suppliers wedding photographers to get their perspective on how and why the delivery of a couple's photo gallery can be late, what they recommend you can do about it, plus how you can avoid this situation happening to you from the very start. Let's get stuck into it.
Unbridely is a community of pro-wedding vendors who believe in freedom and integrity in weddings, giving you options, solutions, tips and tricks to create the experience and memories that you and your fiancé really want and deserve. Because we believe that weddings are a team sport. With how-tos, stories and interviews with recently married couples, we find out what went right and what they'd change if they could go back and do it all over again. I'm Camille, and welcome to the Unbridely podcast.
So I'm not sure what's going on at the moment. I don't know what's in the water, but I have heard from newly married couples recently, messages that are sent to me, and I've seen the posts in Facebook groups, which boil down to a couple being worried and concerned after their wedding because they haven't gotten their photos yet. It seems to be a problem that is quite prevalent at the moment. And that would also depend on whether you're on a couple's side, you're engaged and you're about to get married, or whether you're on the wedding vendor's side of things and hearing this. But, somewhere in the middle is the absolute truth. I want to use this episode as an opportunity to help you understand the common causes of delays like this. Because as Tim from Tim Day Photography said, photographers are only human and personal deadlines get missed every now and then. But let's be honest and talk through it. So what is a normal delivery timeline for wedding photos? Tim has told me that most photographers aim to deliver sneak peeks in 1 to 2 weeks. I've seen sneak peeks as early as 24 hours after, but whatever the case may be, within 2 weeks, there can be what are called like little highlights, anywhere between 6 to 12-ish photos. They're professionally edited and they're shared to the couple in a quick time frame. But then the full gallery, and this is what I'm alluding to, all the photos, generally with the galleries that I've seen, this can span, depending on, if it's an elopement or a full-scale all-day wedding or wedding days, of course, don't forget those multiple days. It can be anywhere from 200 to 300 to 800, 1,000 plus. And this is after they've all been culled down, after all the ones where everyone's eyes are shut and it's a bit blurry and someone's running into frame. That's even when they've taken all those out. It's a bucket load. There are so many photos that a professional wedding photographer hands over to a couple after the wedding, and each one of those photos has to be edited. When a photo is taken with a professional camera, it is saved on the SD card as what's known as a RAW file, R-A-W, not RAR, no, sorry, RAW file. These files can only be opened with dedicated photography editing software. So from the day that they take these photos, they have them in this format that allows them the most creative input into your photos as far as exposure and colour and layers and all the beautiful things that photographers do in their editing software. But every single one of those fucking photos has to be touched, has to have their input, has to be seen by their eyes. So let's say there are only 500 raw photos that a photographer wants to edit. That's a pretty short list, but it's a starting point. Even if they are only spending 30 seconds on each photo, that takes to edit 500 with 30 seconds per photo equals over 4 hours of just sitting there, of clicking through it. And having that time to sit down and do it is another thing altogether. Having that dedicated time where you're not interrupted can be very difficult. You need to set blocks of time for editing. And also, from what I can understand from my photographer colleagues, they sit in the dark room to get their colours right. It's not because they're strange animals, although some of them are. They will sit in their darkened room with their colour calibrated monitors and go through the photos in batches if they can possibly do it. But as you can understand, that's over 4 hours of non-stop. That's only allowing for 30 seconds for each photo, which when it comes down to the hero photos, that gorgeous photo of you and your fiance seeing each other for the first time and the expressions on your faces, you can bet they're spending many more minutes editing photos like that, really bringing out the tones, the expressions, the colors, all the things of the photos for you. So it's reasonable to assume that to do it nonstop would take a full day of work, 8 hours, but then that needs to be shared across doing other things for their business to keep their business ticking along, like taking photos of the next couple at the next wedding, like answering emails, like invoicing people, like updating their website, etc., etc., etc. So the time commitment to editing, and this is for, granted, photographers that choose to edit their own photos. And that's another entire kettle of fish in and of itself, because some photographers choose to take the photos and then hand the raw files on to editors who can go and do the editing independently of the photographer. And that is a business operational choice of a photographer. And it's something that's well worth asking. If time is of the essence to you, you might go out looking specifically for a wedding photographer who hands the editing of their photos off to someone else who outsources the editing. But there would be the argument then of, is it consistent? Is the editing consistent? And is the quality and standard high enough and have the same look and feel of the photographer naturally? So there's a bit of give and take there. James from House of Love Photography says that he thinks keeping to the agreed turnaround times and conditions is very important. And even though he thinks he's only done it a couple of times in his entire career, he hates having to let couples know that he might need a little bit more time. But James also wonders, as his turnaround times are slightly longer than the average, whether that impacts couples' perception of his efficiency and or his value. But James's editing process is slightly different to most photographers he knows. And at the end of the day, the quality that he provides his couples is consistently very, very high. So in my opinion, I feel like as long as your photographer is being realistic and keeps communicating if there are going to be any delays, that the quality in something as crucial as your wedding photos wins all bets. In a year's time, you will always value the higher quality in exchange for a week or two extra, right? So back to what Tim was saying. So most photographers aim to deliver their sneak peeks in 1 to 2 weeks and the full gallery, photo gallery, within 6 to 12 weeks, depending on their, and he says it, business practices, the season. So peak versus off-peak. For us here in Australia, we find spring and summer to be peak season, which makes sense because a lot of our weddings are outdoors and depend on having gorgeous weather. And also the stage of the season, which is super interesting because many vendors consider winter to be off season. There's not as many weddings here in Australia during the off season. It can be a chance, and it's widely viewed as an opportunity to regroup, as an opportunity to do all those things in your business that you haven't been able to do over spring and summer because of the constant nature and attention to detail that's needed during peak season to serve your clients, to make sure that you, gorgeous engaged couple, are looked after and taken care of in the times when you need it most, which is in the lead up to your day and obviously on the day and shortly thereafter. But as we come out of winter, in early spring, I would say, it's considered that for most vendors, they have cleared any backlog that they have of, for example, photographers and videographers of their editing. And so it's like a start of a new cycle for us. It's the start of a new season. So in that context, you can imagine the editing list of your wedding photographer is pretty short. If not, it's empty. So for those first few weddings at the start of spring, you could expect that your wedding photos may come back within the earlier time that's stated on the contract. That could be quite reasonable. But if your wedding is in mid-autumn, heading into winter, you could expect that your wedding photographer's editing queue, and from everyone that I've spoken to about this, they literally put their wedding couples in a list depending on what the date is of their wedding. So someone getting married in September, their editing would be done ahead of someone who got married in October, right? And so if your wedding was at the start of autumn to late autumn, heading into winter, you can imagine it's right at the end of a photographer's peak period. And so it's likely that the list is quite long at that stage, and you'll be put to the bottom of that list in the order of, your wedding day. You don't know all these other couples who have had their wedding day 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead of you, but they're there in this workflow list that only your photographer knows about, that they're trying to manage as best they can. And so it might take right on the edge of, for example, 12 weeks for you to get those photos back, those edited photos at that stage of the season. Really good to keep in mind. One thing that 9 of the 10 photographers came back and said to me was, what does it say in the contract? Before we go into any sort of solutions or things to do, what does their contract say? And that's something so important, so crucial. In my opinion, every person that you contract for your wedding to deliver a product or service, the people that you book in, whether you're paying for them in kind or in money or however you're doing it, you need some sort of contract. You need something written down that says, I'm doing this, you can expect it this date, and this is how much you're paying me and when. Or, this is the trade that we're doing and when. It really doesn't matter what the exchange is, but the parameters of what you're booking someone for really needs to be in there. With the professional wedding vendors that I'm chatting to, dealing with, working with every single week, we have terms and conditions. We don't start delivering a service until those terms and conditions are signed. If there's any questions, then we have a chat about them. But in those terms and conditions, it will stipulate how long it's going to take that photographer, because they set their own rules, right? They're running their own business. If they're able to smash it out in like 4 weeks, no worries. Then they'll put that in their terms and conditions. You can hold them to that. But that is your starting point. What have you agreed to? My colleague Catherine Adams from the Wedding and Event Supplier Hub, who services wedding and event suppliers here in Australia, in the past has discussed how even if a couple pays the booking fee for a vendor without signing their terms and conditions, As long as they've received them and the terms and conditions, aren't deceptive or how else can I put it? The terms and conditions need to be fair. They can't be unreasonable. Then the payment of that booking fee acts as a confirmation that they want to engage in those products or services. So if you've received a contract, terms and conditions from your vendors and you didn't actually sign on the dotted line, it's not a case where you can turn around and go, oh, well, I never signed it, so I didn't agree to it, and, whatever argument you want to come up with next. Now, as I mentioned, 9 out of the 10 photographers I heard from, spoke to, agreed that the first thing a couple should do is look at the terms and conditions. However, there's always one, right? Luke from Luke John Photography said that he doesn't include turnaround times in his contracts because there are a few different reasons. But first up, because it doesn't allow him to be accurate and or have dynamic estimates at different times of the season and or years. So if you imagine how a photographer might set a turnaround time of, let's just pull it out of the air, 8 weeks, and then they don't revisit that time frame again of 8 weeks for years and years. They send out the terms and conditions, they're doing the work. Even when they regularly miss that deadline of 8 weeks, Luke argues, what is that really worth to an engaged couple? To have it in the terms and conditions, 8 weeks, and yet this photographer keeps breaking that. So this is a question for you. Do you want to be told a timeline that is unrealistic 2 years out from your wedding day and then get upset that it's not met? Or would you prefer to be given an accurate estimate the week after your wedding and know that you'll see your wedding gallery, your photo gallery in that time frame? In addition to that, having a turnaround time stipulated in a contract or in terms and conditions implies that there would be a consequence for not meeting that service level. But Luke considers that as there's nothing that either party can really do if the delivery of the client's gallery takes longer than what the contract says, that there's no real point in putting it in there. So what Luke does for his couples is he has email conversations with them to let them know when they can expect their photos depending on his workload at that time. And he thinks that keeping couples informed is very important, that the communication is everything, but he simply takes another point of view on how and when to communicate those times to his couples. All food for thought. You still haven't written your vows yet, have you? Let me help. In around 20 minutes or so, you can easily write personalised wedding vows unlike anything you've heard before that will make your fiancé feel like the most loved, understood and appreciated person on the planet. The How to Write Wedding Vows That Don't Suck instant download 17-page PDF ebook walks you through a step-by-step format for your vows, how to find the right words and phrases to describe your feelings and your fiancé, how to write that crucial first draft, and create your final wedding vows masterpiece. So if you don't know how or even where to start, if you've been Googling your little heart out, or if you've been calling them wedding vows, AEIOU, this ebook is for you. Included in there are also some bonus secrets for getting the most out of your wedding ceremony. So make sure you download your copy right now and get Write Your Wedding Vows crossed off your to-do list today. The link is in the show notes. And outside of that, there can be factors like, as I said, workload, wedding season, unexpected setbacks. Tony from Wilson and Lewis Photography, he's very proud to say we've never broken our contract and delivered late, although sometimes we deliver later than we'd like because admin and meeting clients often push editing onto the back burner. And this is the tricky thing. When there's just one person running a wedding business, they have to wear all the hats, so to speak. That makes me laugh. I asked my daughter the other day, do you know what it means to wear all the hats? And she goes, you've just got a really big head and you've got to put on lots of hats. So then, your head's covered. I'm like, no, no, no. Like when you're responsible for a lot of different things, especially in a business, you're wearing all the hats. So as photographers, they still need to generate business, to create the invoice, to chase up clients, to arrange meetings, to have engagement shoots, and all those sorts of things. And they need to be factored into a week's worth of work for them. So while there might be 5, 6 days a week that they work, there is a much smaller portion of that week than you think that is dedicated to editing and getting the galleries out. Because without prioritizing the other aspects of their business, most business owners will find that they've dropped the ball on aspects of actually doing the important things to bring the money in and to keep their customers happy. So it's a constant balancing act, which I understand isn't exactly your problem either. So why do delays happen? Without knowing your situation specifically, there can be lots of different reasons why your photos could be delayed in the editing process. So Tim from Tim Day Photography, he talked about managing multiple weddings in a short time. So sometimes getting a bit behind during peak season. But for Tim, for example, who's an excellent photographer and a very good business person as well, he makes sure to communicate this to his clients, to his couples proactively. Like before they get in touch with him to go, Tim, where are my photos? He's going, by the way, guys, this is happening. You can expect XYZ. As I mentioned, there's the editing process. So for Tim, for example, he said he worked through his edit list in the order that he shot the weddings, that every couple receives the same care, the same time and attention to detail, that there's no preferential treatment there, which is what you want to hear, right? You want to hear that your wedding photos came before the couples who had their wedding after you. Not that, I got along really well with them, I'll just bump them up the list a bit. I mean, that would really erode the trust between yourself and your photographer if you heard something like that. There are sometimes communication challenges. So K Photography by Karina mentioned how delays often stem from photographers not updating couples. So if your photographer is MIA, that's an issue. But delays in high season, peak season happen, and sometimes it's worth waiting a little bit longer for high quality photos. And Marie from Chasing Eve Photography agreed, and she emphasizes that life comes first. But if she falls behind, she'll always email the couple a week before the due date, as Tim said, proactively, because clients respect this if you communicate with them. It's about being transparent and also being upfront, not letting your couples get panicked and contact you first. So, how can you help yourself? Number one is checking in. Josh from Oak Tree Studios said, sometimes couples forget the terms and delivery times in their excitement, which is totally okay. We know this. We know that you do that, which is why I said right at the start, check your terms and conditions, check those guideline times. It's helpful to revisit your contract or terms to understand what you can expect. Several of the photographers I reached out to, including Tim, encourage couples to reach out if the due date is approaching. Tim said, just ask the question. A polite email is like, hey, how's the photo editing going? It works wonders. And I also went back to Tim and we had a bit of a chat about why couples might feel nervous about asking for updates. Because there are those fears. As I said at the start, you can start to catastrophize. These people have your wedding photos right there, right there. And I've heard the urban myths of photographers going, fuck you, and deleting some and not doing a good job and not being contactable ever again, running off with them. I get it. It's a fear that would be right like in the pit of your stomach that you'll never get those photos. But I can assure you that is maximum 1% of the time that that ever happens, because open communication is key. You chose your photographer for a reason. You've paid them in advance, you've paid them well, and they want to keep being a photographer. And no self respecting photographer will rush or do a bad job just because you checked in with them. You got to wipe that fear out of your head, okay? You chose this photographer for a reason. I'm sure they're really experienced. I'm sure they've got a stunning portfolio. I bet you had a wonderful time with them on your wedding day. Give them a little bit of grace, a little bit of patience. Check in, absolutely. Communicate clearly, but don't panic too much. Kieran from Rexville Photography says, if it's been a little while and you, the couple, haven't heard anything from your photographer, just reach out to them. Even if it's still within the expected turnaround time, Kieran thinks you could just check in. Let them know that you're excited, and if it's possible, kindly ask for an expected delivery date for the final gallery. Because, Kieran says personally, if he hasn't delivered a gallery within 1 month from a couple's wedding day, that him or his team will always send a happy 1 month wedding anniversary email updating their couples about when they should expect to see it come through. So even if it's another 4 weeks away and they've only done this 2 or 3 times towards, as I mentioned, the back end of the season, that every single couple wants to feel important. And this is a part of making them feel special and making sure they're valued. So Kieran says, from a photographer perspective, that yes, he's busy. They're all busy. Yes, it's peak season. But he feels it doesn't take more than 5 minutes to send an email updating the couple about their wedding photos and remembering that these photos are from one of the best days of their life, and let them know that they're next in the queue to be edited. Kieran's opinion is, heck, get up 5 minutes earlier and write the email, Togs. That he's heard stories and he feels like there's no reason why a gallery should take 9 months to get back to a couple. Kieran has very strong opinions. But he said, on the other hand, for those who haven't had their wedding yet, so if you haven't yet had your wedding day and you're still on the hunt for your wedding photographer, perhaps a quick turnaround time is something that you might want to consider. If it's important to you, you might want to ask the question or have a look in their pricing guide, in their guidelines, in their terms and conditions. What is that turnaround time like? Do you need it to be fast? If it's something important to you from the outset, then it's something you really need to discuss before you even hire your photographer. And another photographer talked about the importance of having a clear contract, those terms and conditions. Jazz from In the Mood for Love said that she had heard of couples complain that they didn't sign a contract. So always make sure your photographer's contract clearly outlines the expected delivery time frame, especially during peak season. Jazz also shared stories of couples who faced major delays, and I'm talking about over 12 months, because they didn't have solid contracts and their photographers failed to communicate with them. So one of the ways that you can mitigate this problem, that you can reduce the likelihood that this will happen to you, is by doing your due diligence. And this means not taking every recommendation for a vendor as a fact for you. The photographers you get recommended, they may have been excellent for your sister or your best friend, but you are not your sister or your best friend. A wedding photographer in particular needs to be held accountable for the product and services they provide, because they are the record keepers of everything that happened. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think that some couples get worried about asking that question, how far away are our photos? Because they're slightly worried they're going to piss off the photographer, that they might not take kindly to the interference. But to be frank, if your rapport with your photographer is so bad that you think They might be putting your wedding to the bottom of their editing list or not do such a great job because they think you're being pushy. Then you didn't have the right photographer in the first place. As Tony from Wilson and Lewis Photography says, it may come down to choosing a reliable professional in a crowded marketplace, and that can be hard to do. And he said he guesses this is often why couples are willing to spend big on photographers and maybe skimp on other services. Some inexperienced photographers will promise next day deliveries, photos within 30 days. This is all great and well-meaning, but very hard to keep up with as their business grows or as life gets in the way or mishaps occur. So what do you do if your photographer goes MIA? The first practical step, of course, is to reach out. As Alex from Time with Alex recommends, ask your photographer for an update. But if they don't respond, then that's the first red flag. That's an issue. Tony from Wilson and Lewis Photography says you could always check with other vendors because, as you might have gathered from the way I talk about my vendor colleagues, we're constantly in contact with each other. We're hearing about what's going on around us and in our little corner of the world. So if you contact other vendors from your wedding, good vendors will help you track down your photographer, find out what's going on, and get some sort of an answer for you if it's absolutely necessary. But please give your photographer the first opportunity to get back to you, to explain, to communicate what's going on. So the takeaways for today, I guess, come down to patience and communication. Delays can happen, but communication is key. And photographers, a good photographer would appreciate a polite check-in and having a contract, having terms and conditions with these people that you're hiring. It helps give guide rails to know what to expect and to hold people accountable. And the final word from Alex from Time with Alex, he said communication is everything. If something happens on his end, it's up to him to tell the couple before the deadline passes. And that is really best practice, isn't it? That's what you'd expect. I know a lot of people have reached out to me already with their scenarios and what's happened with them. But if you have a story that you would like to share, then let's help other couples as well. You can DM me on Instagram at Unbridely, and I'll be here chatting with you again next week. That about wraps it up for this episode of the Unbridely podcast. For the links and resources we mentioned, please head to the show notes. And if you love the show, please review and subscribe on the podcast platform you're on now so you don't miss out on a single episode. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, weddings are a team sport. Catch you soon.